Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take complex topics, really dig into the sources, and hopefully pull out those interesting bits that leave you feeling, properly informed. Today, we're diving into something fascinating, really dynamic, and incredibly important. The estuary. Those places, where rivers meet the sea.
And we hear the word estuary thrown around, but nailing down the precise definition and understanding the sheer diversity within these systems, that often gets glossed over.
Yeah, I noticed that straight away.
So we'll explore different ways people define estuaries, look at how geology shapes them, and unpack their vital role ecologically and economically.
Okay, let's unpack that first bit then, the definition. When we talk about an estuary, what exactly are we defining? Because like you said, it seems there's more than one answer floating around in our sources. It challenges that sort of simple picture many of us have.
Indeed. The most common definition, the one you'll see most often, comes from Cameron and Pritchard way back in '63. They said an estuary is a semi-enclosed embayment of the coast in which fresh runoff water mixes with saline water entering from the ocean.
Right.
So the key there is that mixing, the dilution of seawater by fresh water.
So brackish water, that sort of in-between zone. But hang on, what about those parts upstream, the tidal rivers our sources mentioned?
Yeah.
Where the tide pushes up, but maybe the salt doesn't? Do they count under that definition?
That's exactly where it gets tricky. The word estuary itself comes from Latin, aestuarum, meaning tidal inlet, from aestus, tide. So tides are clearly part of the historical idea, but that Cameron and Pritchard definition, it often excludes that upstream tidal river part. The area where the tides influence the rise and fall of water is significant for the environment, the water quality, even the shape of the riverbed, but you don't necessarily get the oceanic saltwater mixing in.
Right, so you get the tidal pulse, but not the salt. That feels like a really important distinction for understanding the whole system. So is there a broader definition that tries to capture that complexity?
Yes, exactly. There's a more comprehensive definition that tries to encompass this wider range. It describes an estuary as a semi-enclosed body of water connected to the sea as far as the tidal limit or the salt intrusion limit and receiving freshwater runoff.
Okay, so it includes both possibilities.
Precisely, and it goes on. However, the freshwater inflow may not be perennial, the connection to the sea may be closed for part of the year, and tidal influence may be negligible.
Wow, okay. That really broadens things.
It does. This wider view includes things like tidal lagoons, those shallow coastal areas often behind barrier islands. It covers drowned coastal valleys where the tide reaches far inland. And even, get this, inverse estuaries.
Inverse? What does that mean?
Yeah, places where evaporation is so high it actually exceeds the freshwater coming in. So they can become more salty than the ocean, hypersaline, but they still fit the basic criteria, semi-enclosed, connected to the sea.
That's fascinating. And then our sources throw another curveball. Freshwater estuaries, like in the Great Lakes. That really messes with the whole river meets the sea idea. How does that work? No salt involved at all.
It's a great point. It shows the core concept isn't just about salt. A freshwater estuary happens when a river flows into a large freshwater lake. Think of a big river hitting Lake Superior, for example.
Okay.
Both are freshwater, yes, but they might have different chemistries, different temperatures, different sediment loads. So you still get a mixing zone within that semi-enclosed area where the river enters the lake.
Ah, I see. So it's the mixing of two distinct water bodies that matters.
Exactly. And instead of ocean tides, these systems are often driven by things like seiches, which are like standing waves sloshing back and forth in the lake, or storm surges.
Right.
So the fundamental idea, the thread connecting all these definitions, really boils down to that mixing of distinct waters within a partially enclosed basin. That semi-enclosed nature with its specific channels and shallow areas, that's key. It's what makes them different from just an open bay or the coast, whatever the water source.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's not just salty versus fresh. It's about the meeting and mixing within a specific kind of place. So that fundamentally changes how we think about what qualifies. But once these places are formed, how do they actually work? What makes them tick day to day?
Well, they are incredibly dynamic places, constantly changing. There's typically this two-layer flow happening. You've got the less dense fresh water trying to flow out towards the sea on the surface, while the denser, saltier ocean water pushes inwards along the bottom. This creates this constant exchange, the circulation pattern that moves salt, nutrients, sediments, everything around the system.
And that must create a pretty challenging environment for anything trying to live there, right? I mean, our sources talk about huge swings in oxygen levels, salinity, how much mud is in the water. It sounds pretty extreme.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tough place to call home. Take salinity. It can go from almost zero fresh water near the river mouth or tidal limit, all the way up to full ocean salinity, maybe 3.4% salt, near the entrance to the sea.
Wow.
And that changes not just where you are, but with every tide, every season, how much rain there's been. So organisms living there need some pretty special tricks.
Like what kind of tricks?
Well, you get osmoconformers. Their bodies just kind of go with the flow. Their internal saltiness matches the outside water. Then you have osmoregulators, which work really hard to keep their internal balance stable, pumping salts in or out as needed. And many creatures burrow down into the mud or sand. That helps them escape predators, sure, but also escape those rapid changes in salinity or temperature, or even periods when the oxygen gets low in the water.
So despite being tough, somehow life thrives.
It absolutely thrives, because even with the challenges, estuaries are incredibly nutrient-rich and usually quite sheltered. That combination makes them some of the most productive natural habitats on Earth.
And that's why people call them the nurseries of the sea, isn't it?
Exactly. That term captures it perfectly. They provide sheltered waters, loads of food, perfect conditions for countless species to reproduce, lay eggs, and for their young to grow up before heading out to the open ocean or migrating upriver.
So what kinds of specific habitats do we find within an estuary? It's not all just muddy water.
Right. Oh, not at all. The variety in depth, salinity, water flow creates a whole mosaic of habitats.
Yeah.
You've got things like salt marshes, those grassy wetlands you see lining the edges. They're absolutely vital, filtering pollution, protecting the shore from erosion, soaking up storm surges. Tough plants live there, adapted to salty soil and flooding. Then underwater, you might find seagrass meadows. These are like underwater fields of grass, crucial food and shelter for fish, crabs, manatees, sea turtles. They're also really sensitive, a good indicator of water quality.
Okay.
In warmer climates, you get mangrove forests. Trees right in the salt water on the coast, incredible storm buffers, amazing root systems that trap sediment, and critical nursery grounds for fish. Plus, they store a ton of carbon.
Right, the blue carbon thing.
Exactly. And then there are the tidal flats, those muddy or sandy areas exposed when the tide goes out. Might look bare, but they are packed with worms, tiny shellfish, bacteria at the base of the food web, really important feeding grounds for birds and fish when the tide comes back in.
And oyster reefs, too, right? Those sound amazing.
Yes. Oyster reefs. These aren't just piles of oysters. They're complex, three-dimensional structures built by generations of oysters. They provide homes for crabs, small fish, barnacles. And oysters themselves are phenomenal filter feeders. They clean the water incredibly effectively.
So, with all these different habitats and the challenging conditions, what's the overall picture for biodiversity? Is it lots of different types of species or just huge numbers of a few tough ones?
That's a good question. Generally, the actual number of different species might be a bit lower than, say, a coral reef or the open ocean, simply because the conditions are so demanding and variable.
Okay.
But the abundance, the sheer number of individuals of those species that are adapted can be enormous. Think about it. Most of the fish and shellfish we eat in the U.S., salmon, herring, crabs, oysters, shrimp, many of them rely on estuaries for at least part of their lives.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that high a percentage.
Yeah, estuaries are critical for our seafood. And it's not just fish. Migratory birds depend on them as vital rest stops and feeding grounds on their long journeys, or like crucial service stations on avian highways.
So clearly essential for wildlife, the nurseries, the stopovers. But our sources really hammer home how important they are for us economically, culturally. It goes way beyond just fishing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If you zoom out and look at the human connection, estuaries are invaluable. They are genuine economic powerhouses. One statistic that jumped out at me, 22 of the world's 32 largest cities back in the early 90s were built on estuaries.
Wow.
And in the U.S., these coastal watershed regions, which include estuaries, they're only about 13% of the land area, but account for 40% of the population and nearly half, 47% of the economic output.
That's staggering.
It really is. They're centers for tourism, boating, shipping ports are almost always in estuaries, and of course, commercial fishing. Those fisheries we mentioned. In 2022 in the U.S., commercial and recreational fishing, heavily reliant on estuaries, supported 2.3 million jobs and generated $321 billion in sales.
Yeah, huge numbers.
Huge. And beyond the direct money, they're also our natural protectors, those ecosystem services we hear about. Estuaries deliver big time. Salt marshes, Seagrass beds, mangroves, they act like natural buffers, soaking up floodwaters, reducing wave energy, protecting coastal communities from storms and erosion.
Like natural infrastructure.
Exactly. One source mentioned a single acre of wetland, just a foot deep, can hold something like 330,000 gallons of floodwater. And mangroves can knock down wave heights by 50, even up to 99%. That's serious protection.
Incredible.
Then there's the Environmental Cleaning Service. They act as natural filters. Rivers carry sediment, pollutants, excess nutrients off the land, and estuary habitats like marshes and oyster reefs trap and process a lot of that before it reaches the open ocean. Oysters filtering water, marsh plants absorbing nutrients. It's a natural water treatment system. And we touched on climate change fighting. That blue carbon stored in coastal wetlands, marshes, mangroves, seagrasses is a really big deal. They can suck up and store carbon way faster, sometimes 10 times faster per area than mature tropical forests. The example from Pamlico Sound was amazing, storing carbon equivalent to emissions from 2 million cars.
That's a superpower we definitely need right now.
For sure. And finally, don't forget the cultural and educational value. Many coastal cultures, especially indigenous communities, have deep, centuries-long connections to estuaries. They're also fantastic living laboratories for science education for anyone to learn about ecology.
So they give us all this protection, economic activity, clean water, climate regulation. But it sounds like we're putting them under enormous pressure. The sources definitely highlight some major threats.
That is the unfortunate reality. They provide so much, but they're on the front line of human impact. A huge one is pollution and eutrophication. Runoff from farms, cities, roads, washes, fertilizers, pesticides, heavy metals, plastic debris, everything into the rivers that feed estuaries.
Right.
The excess nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers and sewage, cause eutrophication. That's when algae blooms explode, then die and decompose, sucking all the oxygen out of the water. This creates dead zones, hypoxic zones where fish and shellfish can't survive.
Like the big one in the Gulf of Mexico, our sources mentioned.
Exactly. That one can cover thousands of square miles. It directly impacts fisheries and the whole ecosystem. And it's hard to fix because the pollution often comes from sources way upstream, far from the coast itself.
A diffuse problem.
Very much so. Then there's straightforward habitat loss. Historically, we just filled in wetlands, saw them as wasteland, ripe for building ports, cities, farms. So estuaries physically shrank. And things like dams built far upstream can trap sediment and reduce freshwater flow, essentially starving the estuary downstream. The Colorado River Delta is a sad example. Used to be vast wetlands, now it's mostly salt flats because the river water rarely reaches it anymore.
Yeah, that's stark.
Overfishing is another big one. We talked about oysters in Chesapeake Bay. They used to be so numerous they could filter the entire bay in days. Now, due to overharvesting and disease, it takes them almost a year. That has huge knock-on effects for water quality and the rest of the ecosystem.
It shows how interconnected everything is.
Definitely. And layered on top of all this is climate change. Sea level rise is a huge threat. It can drown marshes, push saltwater further inland, changing the whole balance. More extreme storms mean more polluted runoff, more erosion, more stress on these systems. It's a threat multiplier.
It really paints a picture of ecosystems that are incredibly valuable, but also incredibly fragile and caught in the crosshairs of our activities. It does seem like there's growing recognition, though, with efforts like NOAA's restoration work.
Yes, thankfully there is growing awareness. Groups like the National Estuarine Research Reserves Network, the NOAA Restoration Center, they're doing vital work studying, protecting, and trying to restore these habitats. It shows that we can make a difference, and the return on investment, both environmentally and economically, can be significant.
Absolutely. That restoration piece feels crucial.
It is. Protecting what's left and actively restoring what's been degraded is essential for the future of these ecosystems and honestly for the future of the coastal communities that depend on them.
So wrapping this up, what have we unpacked today? We went from the surprisingly nuanced definitions of what an estuary even is much more than just river meets sea through how they're actually formed by geology over vast timescales, explored the really dynamic, sometimes tough, but incredibly rich life they support, and finally saw just how deeply connected they are to our own lives, our economy, our safety, our culture. They really are these unique borderlands, right? Where freshwater and saltwater meet and create something uniquely valuable.
Absolutely. They're dynamic mixing zones, critical interfaces. And maybe that leaves us with a question for you, the listener, thinking about how vital these estuaries are, but also how vulnerable. How might our choices, even things we do far from the coast, affect these connections? Understanding estuaries, it's more than just learning a definition, isn't it? It's about recognizing this absolutely critical piece of our planet's machinery, one that connects land, sea, atmosphere, and ultimately connects directly back to us.